talk about our research. But in the meantime, thanks to this new capacity we have to converge via Zoom, we're taking some time today to celebrate the launch of the publication of Transoceanic Animals as Spectacle in Early Modern Spain, written by my Texas Tech colleague, John Beusterien, recently published by Amsterdam University Press. Um, so this book is the latest in a series called Connected Histories in the Early Modern World with University of Amsterdam Press. It focuses on the connectedness of the world during a period in history when the unprecedented number of people, Africans, Asians, Americans, Europeans, made transoceanic or other long distance journeys throughout history. And from what I understand, this series is inspired by Sanjay Subramaniam's innovative approach to early modern historical scholarship, and it explores topics that highlight the cultural impact of the movement of people, animals, and objects on a global scale. So John's book begins with an introduction that has a very witty title, Armored Beasts and the Elephant in the Room. And then it goes on to work through subsequent chapters on different animals such as Hawaii, the elephant, Abada, the rhinoceros, Fuleko, the armadillo, Jarama, the bull, and Maghreb, the lion. And then the book ends with a discussion of what John calls biogeography as a teaching tool. Um, so I'll just begin our virtual celebration of John's publication. First of all, I need to thank Hema, who is the person with the technological know-how necessary to organize an event such as this, as well as our two invited speakers. We're very happy to have with us here for a while this afternoon, Erica Gaffney, who is the Senior Commissioning Editor at Amsterdam University Press, and Professor Abel Alves, who is Professor and Chair of the Department of History at Ball State University, and he's a specialist in colonial Latin America, early modern Europe, and animal studies. So what we'll do with our time together here, Erica will introduce the book again as kind of a representative of Amsterdam University Press. Um, then John will give us an overview of the book through walking us through a few images, followed by a commentary by some questions from Abel. And then I will ask John some questions, but then John will have a good 15, 20 minutes or so to answer any questions you may have about his work. Just kind of a bureaucratic issue. If you could please write your questions and comments in the Zoom chat function and send them to everyone. Gemma, Bella, and I will kind of coordinate and pass those questions on to John. In our virtual time together today would work best if everyone were to, of course, keep your mute functions on. If in the question and answer period, of course, if you've asked a question and John is responding to it, then feel free to unmute yourself and we can have a fruitful discussion that way. So thank you everyone so much for being here. And we will pass the word on to Erica Gaffney from the University of Amsterdam University Press. Thank you, Erica, for getting us started today.
Oh, it's my great pleasure, and it's so nice to see everybody. All right, so my first collaboration with John was on his book Canines in Cervantes and Velázquez, an animal studies reading of early modern Spain, published in 2013 in Ashgate's New Hispanism series. It's a pleasure and a privilege to have had the opportunity to work with him again, this time on transoceanic animals. From my first reading of the book proposal, I was enthusiastic about this topic. It immediately struck me that the study promised meaningful contributions to scholarship on early modern Spain, transatlantic studies, and animal studies. The resulting book is important as well as interesting. It enriches our understanding of the role of animals in the development of commercial theater in Spain and of the modern bullfight. By examining how animal spectacles had profound repercussions on the emergence of the modern zoo and the Natural History Museum, it also contributes to emerging scholarly conversations on the importance of Spain in the history of science. Others at this launch will be saying more probably about the full extent of John's scholarly expertise, about his innovative approach, and about how the book furthers and deepens several relevant strands of current scholarly dialogue. So I'd like to express my admiration for an aspect of John's accomplishment that I've been in a position to observe as a publisher, but which may not be immediately apparent to every reader. That is his managerial expertise as an author. I particularly appreciate and admire the way he marshaled the forces of various communities of stakeholders to enhance and strengthen the project. These communities include, at a minimum, the press, the series editors and peer reviewers, students, entities within his university, and other scholars in the various fields that relate to the book's topic. And I should mention here that the series editors are Christina Lee, who I see here from Princeton, and also Julia Schleck from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. I offer the image selection process as just one example of the kind of interaction I mean. John had the foresight to check with us at an early stage to ensure that his chosen images were of sufficient quality. If the quality wasn't adequate, he found workarounds. In at least one case, enlisting the collaboration of a talented student to ensure the best presentation for a map. By the time of the delivery for production, he had assembled the perfect illustrations program for this book in the correct format. It often happens that a book's production is delayed at this stage as we eliminate or seek substitutes for art files that are too low resolution to use. But due to John's diligence, attention to detail, and instinct to consult with the right people at the right moment, in this case, we didn't lose any time. Congratulations, John, on this significant achievement. I'm so proud and excited to have had the study in the Connected History, to have this study in the Connected History series and in AUP's history list. It's a beautiful book, as well as a substantial contribution to the literature, and I'm looking forward to seeing the journal reviews in due course.
Thanks a lot, Erica. So John, please tell us a little bit about your book.
Sure, yeah. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm John Beusterien. I'm a professor of Spanish. I'm also the coordinator of comparative literature at Texas Tech University. I'm speaking to you today from Lubbock, Texas. It's the traditional homeland of the Apache and Kiowa tribe of Oklahoma, Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes, the Jicarilla and Mescalero Apache tribes, and the Comanche Nation. So today, I'm talking to you about this. This is the book, the physical material book. It has 256 pages. It has 30 images. It has an index, and so it has 3 central chapters, as well as an introduction and a conclusion. And so I would like to publicly thank you, Erica, for all the time that you work with me. Thank you, Susan, for helping organize it. Thank you, Abel, for coming in also to have a conversation with me today about the book and to put us in dialogue with some of the ideas in the book. Thank all of you for coming. It's great to see your faces. If you, at the end of this is only going to be a short hour of something that's been more than 10 years in the making. If you want to connect with me, either a comment or question or an argument, please feel free to do so over email. Thank you to the book editors at Connected Histories of the Early Modern World who saw the possibility of including animals as part of those connected histories from an early stage, I guess, especially Christina and Julia. Thank you to Texas Tech. There was a Humanities Center Animal Studies group, many of whom are here today. Thanks to you. Thanks to, also there's a Seville Center, a Texas Tech University Seville Center. And thanks to my students who are here today and my colleagues, other colleagues who are here today. And finally, a special thanks to Hema, who's organizing all of this and making it possible that I can talk to you. So I'm just going to show a couple images, and I'm going to talk for less than maybe 5 minutes or so. And we're going to try to, and then I'm going to speak to Abel again, who I thank, who's a historian, and Susan, who's a scholar of culture and literature, with them, and then hopefully we'll be able to give you a chance if you have any questions you'd like to share. So I'm going to try to show you this a few images here just for a few minutes. So again, the cover of the book is this, the image in the top right corner. What is this? It's a section of a ewer, and this ewer is called the Scipio Africanus ewer and basin. The image which I was able to get acceptance for is from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. And it's a sort of a black and white, and it looks as if it's silver. I was able to go a few summers ago and take a picture of it. It was done by a master goldsmith, and it's gilt layer over silver. And one also aspect of, if you just look at the cover of the book, you won't know that this is the ewer. The ewer comes a basin. The basin is actually not on display. And even if you were to see the basin, you probably wouldn't be able to see what's on the underside of the basin, which is an image of a bull jumping on someone, which ended up being important for one of the chapters in the book. So again, the name of the book is Transoceanic Animals as Spectacle in Early Modern Spain. One really important thing to establish at the top of any discussion of the book is it's what place does it cover and what time does it cover? The main place is in Spain in the 16th and 17th century. Spain under the Habsburgs, and I'm especially interested in the late 16th century. In particular, I'm interested in that period because it was the height of King Philip II's power. He incorporated in about 1580 Portugal within the Spanish Empire. And that sort of is the setting, the time, and the place for the entire book. And the reason the ewer shows a Roman emperor in a victory parade. And basically in 1583, this king who had been in Portugal returned to Spain, and he brought with him from Lisbon, where he had been living, he moved into Madrid. And in his house nearby, he brought an elephant and a rhino. So that's the kind of time and place of the book. And then just for a moment, I'll say kind of what's new about the book. And also, why is the book important? Basically, as been mentioned, what I do in this book is I give a name for 5 animals that never had a name. So as Susan mentioned, there's an elephant and a rhino, who I talk about in book 1. The elephant's name is Hawaii, and the rhino's name is Bada. In chapter 2, which is this inspiration for this picture, there's a story about an armadillo who I named Fuleko. And then in the chapters 3, I talk about a lion and a bull, Maghreb and Harama. So what's new about that? Why is that relevant? Well, first, I do discuss the first 2 in context of conversations about the history of the zoo as an institution in the first chapter. And the second chapter, I discuss the armadillo as part of a museum, as part of a natural history museum. And in the third chapter, I discuss it as part of, I look at the history of staged animal combats. When people think about Spain, they think about bullfights. And I also think about the history of bullfighting. So these are the kinds of spectacles that I'm interested in. So that's more about what's new about the book. I think talking about why is the book important is a very difficult thing to do, especially for specialists and non-specialists. And I'll just spend the last minute saying, beginning the conversation about why it's important. Because ultimately, yeah, I think my readers will decide if it's really important, but my perception on its importance is that I hope to begin a conversation to change how animals are talked about, how they are thought about. So when I named those 5 animals, I felt to some degree as if I was changing the grammar of the way we might talk about animals. They never had a name. I gave them a name. I didn't call them an it. I considered if it was a he or a she animal. So basically in this book, I think it's important to understand the particular individual, the particular creature, rather than the general group. In the introduction to the book, I talk about one scientific methodology, which is biogeography, which is locating animal habitats and where they're from. And that's definitely a group sort of thing, looking at an animal and its group and its history. And I say it's also important to consider an individual animal as basically a humanities biogeography. So I'll just kind of conclude there, just to repeat, in changing the grammar about how animals are perceived, I will also hope to change or become part of a conversation where we also change not just the grammar of animals, but animacy more broadly. And another thing that I do in the introduction is I talk about like thinking about animacy, thinking about the planet, thinking about the earth, thinking about the earth as system and the earth itself as another sort of creature, being of whom we should need to think about changing the way we think and talk about it. So I think I'll just conclude there. I'll show you this last picture of some things that didn't make it into the book. This is the far right corner is a picture from a rare manuscript. It's the only one that shows the Abada's mahout. This was when the mahout was the trainer. This person came from India with Abada. And this picture also didn't make it into the actual book, but it was a student, an art student, Yin Ting Fin, who you can see she did this in 2017. I told her the story and I told her what I was interested in wanting to re-envision and recreate. In this old manuscript, the description of this person says that he slept with Abada all the way from India. And this was a long trail to get there. It was all on boat, had to go through Southern Africa. And so this was just an image that she created. Later in the book, we also work with another student, Caleb, who added some boats from the 16th century Portuguese vessels, and he added them in this, and that was the actual image that it was included in the book. And I guess the last thing I'll say is that I'll just sort of end there. If you are interested in wanting to see the introduction, the Amsterdam University Press makes that available publicly. And again, if I did put my email on a couple of those slides, if you're interested in following up with questions that you don't get to today. I know I've been actually to 2 book launches. I don't know if this is your first one, but I was unable to ask questions and I did, and to some authors was able to reach out later, and we had a conversation about some of the ideas talked. So earlier this semester.
Great, John. So now we have an historian's perspective with Abel, please.
Okay, thank you, Susan. First of all, it is an honor and a privilege to be here for this book launch. And recently, I was at a Zoom workshop where I heard John describe himself as not being a historian, but he is. Transoceanic Animals is a truly magnificent collection of microhistories, but it does not use Carlo Ginzburg's heretical Miller or Katharina Kepler accused of witchcraft, as Rublock does in her book. Doesn't use people to open a window to another time and culture. Rather, Transoceanic Animals uses traveling, non-human animals to cast light on human behavior in the Spanish Empire, without forgetting at the same time that these animals had their own behaviors, agencies, and contexts. Hence that biogeographical emphasis that does show up in the book. John writes about how Spaniards displayed imperial power through non-human animals, and very richly too, as in his description of Juan de Arce's 1583 ewer. And I'd just like to briefly read a couple of passages from the book, starting with this one, wrong page, starting with this one on page 98, where there is a picture of the ewer. And John writes, Arce depicts Abada as a peaceful animal. She is not fighting the elephant, which is standard Pliny the Elder stuff, if you know your mythologies generated about these animals. Images and stock descriptions of the rhino throughout the 16th century show rhinos and elephants at war with each other. Arce also does not depict Hawaii as a war animal. It depicts the elephant with the mounted box, suggesting its previous role as a war animal, now converted into a peaceful captive. Arce's elephant and rhino walk side by side peacefully, and lions and bulls celebrate Philip II as Scipio Africanus, who supposedly has fully realized the Roman notion of Pax Universalis. Yes, we use animals. And John does focus in on Spanish thinking about elephants and rhinoceroses in a fully contextualized fashion. By references to the availability of Pliny the Elder and books of emblems, but also by how animals could be viewed by the general populace, displayed at a hospital in Madrid. In that sense, he goes beyond the traditional standard old-fashioned intellectual history, incorporates social history, and does make himself a cultural historian in the history of human interaction with other animals. John readily remembers and honors the non-human animals who were used and abused. Naming them is a significant part of the honor he grants them in the course of this book. And he actually already answered my first question, so we'll have one less question that I feel compelled to ask in the question and answer period. If a rhinoceros, though, as he writes about a rhinoceros, could be aggressive at times, ultimately leading to the mutilation of poor Abada, the rhinoceros, rhino aggression is explained by John using knowledge of ethology, the scientific study of animal behavior. And just a couple of sentences now from page 58, the respect that John shows the animals. Writing, focusing on the animal here now, not just the human perceptions of the animals. 58, female rhinos are solitary creatures, and when protecting their territory against intrusion, they, like their male counterparts, can be tough and aggressive, particularly during the estrus cycle every 4 months or so. This is a real animal. This is an animal with agency, with its own life, its own context, and John shows that respect, hence the naming. John Beusterien has crafted a rich, multi-layered cultural history with multiple agencies, human and non-human alike. And John Beusterien really is the finest of cultural historians. I'm not the only person to think this. In fact, I noticed that Helen Cowie is with us here. I would be tonight in Europe. Hi, Helen. And just to give you some sense of how historians respect his work, I quote from the back cover here. Helen Cowie writes, "Transoceanic Animals recounts the stories of 5 itinerant animals who lived and died in early modern Spain. From a Brazilian armadillo to whose carapace graced a cabinet of curiosities in Seville, to an Indian rhinoceros who bathed in the Tagus, the Tej. It reveals the multiple meanings assigned to exotic beasts and examines their shifting roles as specimen, spectacle, symbol, and muse. Engaging, illuminating, and sometimes harrowing, Beusterien's book makes an important contribution to human-animal history John, you are a historian. Sorry, you may not want to be one, but you are. And sorry about the phone. You'll understand why I forgive my students when their phones go off. In any event, you're not here to hear me talk. You're here rather to interact with John. And I had my phone on. I should have muted it. Sorry, folks, so that I knew my time limit. And at this point, I won't ask John about why he named the animals. He alluded to that. Perhaps you can elaborate on that later in interaction with the audience. Instead, I'll open with the following question, John. One of your major contributions in this book is that you show the transitioning from court menagerie to public zoological park in a European context. I was wondering if you might want to elaborate on that now and that aspect of your book, which I do find important and compelling for the Zoom audience here, the transition from menagerie to zoo.
Abel, thank you so much for your comments, and also thank you for the question. I mentioned earlier the rhino and the elephant. When this king came back to Madrid, he did something with these two animals that was a little surprising. I mean, those animals were part of an international gift-giving economy where powerful people from India to China gave away animals as gifts. And the king decided to do something. He wanted to show them, and he didn't just bring them to his own private palace, which could have been a number of places in Spain. He brought it to Madrid, and he put both animals, he brought them to the city, and he showed them within the city. And so one of my biggest surprises when I wrote this book and what I wanted to find out about was where he put them and what was going on when he showed them. I mean, this is the zoo, basically right after the French Revolution, there was a menagerie in Versailles in France. And then the public came, and then they were told, you can go see them. And this was going to be a place to study animals. And that happened, that was in the late 1700s when this first sort of official public zoo came. I'm talking again about the late 1500s, and this king decides not to put them in his own private place just to show his buddies, but he wants to show people in the city. And as I researched more of this, I found out he put them in a hospital. So why that? And so one of the big stepping back, one of the most important parts of the story of this book is that in Spain at this time, this was the same time Shakespeare plays were going on in a public setting in Shakespeare's England. Spain actually had a bigger play-going public than in England at this time. And they constructed two official theaters for the public, but then they also had all these others. The others were in hospitals. And so I thought that, I'd spent a lot of time trying to figure out why the hospital, what's the connection. It has a lot to do with charity, the king wanting to be charitable to his people, but it also connects to this growing idea of a public group of people, which would be developed more in France. And another interesting thing I found out, and I thank you, Abel, because I was writing about this book. I think you might have sent me a reference to a French historian of zoos, who also, and this person found out that in the 1600s, zoos, when in Versailles, there was also a hospital built by the same architect who built the animal enclosure. And so there was a link between seeing and looking at and spectacle, and even looking at people who were crazy or were sick, and also seeing animals. And that was something that I was interested in, although it's not something I really explore in this book, but it seems that was part of a complex history, which later happened in England. So I don't know if that answered your question. So Spain was an early example of what would later be called the zoo. And this was, and I still think there are a lot of questions about these hospitals and what was going on, but it was a fascinating topic. So thanks for that question. Was that answering your question?
Yes, very much so, John. And I think your book does lay this out much more so than you're giving yourself credit for. That, you know, it may not be the full-fledged zoo, but there's something going on here which is transitioning towards that. And with the educative and entertainment functions going on there in the hospital courtyard area. So, you know, thank you. I think you have answered that question. Just one other question then, because I really think it's, you know, we're here tonight for the audience, or at 12 noon Central Time, we're here for the audience. A broad question this time, a broad one. Conservationists often worry that we spend too much time focused on marquee species, you know, from polar bears to elephants, rhinoceroses, and mountain gorillas. Your little armored ones, the armadillos, are even considered very cute by many, including by me. So is the field of historical animal studies starting out like the writing of human history did, focused on kings, focused on the greats, in this case, marquee species and animals we adore among domesticates like dogs? And of course, I first ran across your work with your wonderful canines in Cervantes and Velasquez book. So are we starting with the greats? Are we starting with marquee species? Are we starting with these individualized objects that we admire, that we love? Is that the same pattern we had with the writing of human history? What about pigeons? What about rats? We do see some people like Donna Haraway trying to push in that direction, to look at the commensal species, to look at the species that define our urban environment and live with us now. But you know, are we stuck, first of all, looking at the rhinos, the elephants? Is animal studies still stuck in the biography of the greats? Where do you see animal studies going, to even broaden it further? Why your commitment, and where are you going with this as a literary scholar to begin with in your career?
There are so many things that came to my mind when you were talking. I mean, I think the first thing, I'll talk from the book perspective. One of the important things I say in my book is that I'm not really doing a biography of an animal. And I think that's important. I do what a traditional historian would do. I do try to figure out the date that Fuleco the armadillo was born and the date that Fuleco the armadillo died. I do what would be considered biography, but I call all of this biogeography, and I consider the idea of a humanities biogeography very important, which is in the time we live in the Anthropocene, the idea that there are these long-term natural habitats where animals live and like separate from humans is kind of a misnomer. And so I think it's important to think about biogeography from a humanities point of view. And where am I going with this? I mean, the first thing, because I saw a student who actually I Zoomed with yesterday, because I'm doing a kind of a collaborative project on insects right now. And I do think like we have to start thinking about individual insects even. So I will, though, I mean, I got to see this membracid yesterday for the first time. I entered in virtually into someone's lab. So I do think that it's a broader question. It's not just what's called, often called charismatic megafauna, which is, I see the charisma not just coming from the big animals. Maybe I'll talk a little bit about the armadillo. I mean, armadillo here in Texas is mostly a pest. For most people, it's just roadkill. Although one of my students said when they were young, they had it, they tried to have an armadillo pet. I don't know. I don't want to go too far talking about armadillo unless there's more questions. Although I think that the American side, I mean, I think there's a big story in this book about what's called Far East or Asia or India and China. But there's also a really big story about America in this book. The armadillo Fuleco came probably from Brazil, who was later in some noble's collection in Seville. The American story is broad. I mean, when we were talking about zoos, one of the amazing things I found out when I did this was in the 16th century, there were maps of Montezuma's zoo all over Europe. They were published early in German books. There were pictures of Tenochtitlan, and it showed, and in the middle of it, it says House of Animals. And they were they were propaganda for the Habsburgs. And so certainly this King Philip got an idea when he was doing his own imperial project of this American zoo that was in the middle of this American city. It was his way of appropriating this American form of showing of dominance. So I thought that was really interesting, the whole American story, in that case, the Atlantic story that's behind this book. So yeah, where am I going with this? I'm very interested in collaborating with people who are in different fields and talking about some of these ideas and doing projects with them. That's my biggest passion right now.
Thanks, John. I think that does it for me, and I think we can hand it back to Susan now.
Oh, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Abel and John. I'm going to be really brief. Now might be a good time for people to begin to write their questions into the chat function as I speak briefly, just so that we can kind of get going with starting up a discussion, and people can ask John specific questions about his work. So I'll just, reading the book, I was very appreciative and really fascinated by a number of things. One was simply, as John has said, just seeing how one does a biogeography of each animal, just how that works. It's a very interdisciplinary approach that bridges the gap between the social sciences and the humanities. I found that to be really interesting. And John gives us 5 or 6 models in this book of how you pull that off, what that looks like. And so, yeah, and just it's an enormously productive concept to think about how spectacles were part of an historical structure that mobilizes animal bodies for the maintenance of a global Spanish empire. That's a new take to the Golden Age that is also really productive. And the concept of mobility as well was something that tied everything together in a fascinating way. I loved how, John, you talked about how the animals became exotic, because an animal inherently is not exotic, but how you talked about the process of how an animal becomes exotic through transoceanic displacement, basically through being translated from the foreign to the home. You relied on Jacques Lesra's work a little bit when you talked about producing, a cultural surplus of value in both directions as these animals were brought from one place to another. And that was, again, a very innovative way of approaching the culture of this time period that I think is going to open a lot of doors for other people, frankly. And of course, because I'm a cultural urban geographer, I was really excited by the same thing that Abel said. I love this hospital, theater, zoo hybrid space during the reign of Philip II. This it really adds a whole nother dimension to our understanding of the built environment in early modern Madrid that doesn't get too much attention. So again, that's kind of another door that I think John's book has opened up to people in other disciplines. And I was very moved actually in the conclusion, where you state that the final goal of the book is to look towards what you call an earth ethics. And you talk about the goal of an earth ethics is kind of to emphasize a history of destruction, thinking of 21st century readers, 21st century students of Spain, of animal studies in general. This is kind of a goal of an earth ethics, emphasizing a history of destruction in order to inspire these animal spectacles of, you call them mutual compassion between humans and animals. So I guess I don't want to talk too long. There's a lot to say here. But John, can you just talk really briefly about, position this book within the really exciting work that's happening now within Hispanic animal studies and kind of Hispanic environmental humanities, discussions of the post-human, Anthropocene. Most of those studies I've come across with deal with 20th, 21st century culture, but you're working on the early modern period. So yeah, how do you position yourself within what's happening again with Hispanic animal studies, which is of course very closely connected to what's going on in the environmental humanities? What are the debates that are happening, and what is this book? What kind of voice is it going to have, you think?
Thank you, Susan. To answer your question very briefly and then go back to it, a lot of graduate students who are, well, I'll just start with this. My training was in literature, and I love all the writing of Cervantes, especially, and I also do a lot of work with plays. A lot of graduate students now they don't want to take the time or not interested to really sit with those books. And I do think that this sort of approach opens them up again for them in some ways. So I would say one part of the future is just a general reopening of interest in the fascinating books of my period. I mean, the last book is a whole book of all the most important poets of the country of Spain in the 1630s, and they all write a poem praising this kind of bloodbath that just went on between all of these different animals in front of them. It was basically a staged combat. You ask about environmental humanities. Well, just before I answer that, just thank you again for all your comments. And I just want to underscore a couple of them. One is you talked about the movement. I should say, and if there's time, we can talk later, but all of my files about this book is not transoceanic. It's all moving animals. I mean, the idea of moving animals is my father, like everything that I've been working on for the past 6 or 7 years, whenever I find something, it's about moving animal. That was sort of the essence of this. So I think you were picking up on what was driving me before this project even became a project. So thank you for mentioning that. And also thank you for mentioning the thing about the hospital. I mean, as I said, I'm really interested in plays. And plays, the first theater in Spain was not called a theater, it was called a corral, which is a choral and it's a specific structure that is actually Arabic, it's Spanish, it's a housing structure, and it's fascinating. And it was also the structure with early buildings and early cities are, and it's all I see a couple of my colleagues in Seville. I mean, it's a lot. The houses in Seville are still made this way. So thank you for talking about the theater and the hospital, and because there's a lot to talk about there about the specific architecture. Last thing then, obviously I'm dealing with animals, which is sort of a catchword for environment. So I think that is, in a superficial way, it's behind a lot of what I'm doing, and I'm seeing, again, I am dealing with the past. I'm dealing with this specific historic moment. I do feel that my new projects, some of the new projects that I'm working on, will be taking the experience I've had with reflecting on this period and thinking about how it matters for the present, both with respect to thinking more slowly about how to make change, not just through, the last part of the book, I talk about this shield that has this image on it, and it just says, hope for the future. And the king looked at the shield. But I really talk about what was the shield made out of? It was made out of beautiful feathers of birds. And I talk about the red, and this shield is found in the armory in Madrid, and it's a beautiful shield. It was made by people in America, and the red feathers from a quetzal. And I actually say, we can't just read that what I would call a tweet in Latin, which is in the middle, which the king looked at, but we have to think about the whole provenance of that, and we have to do you can't just you've got to go slowly. So, I mean, I think I'm trying to answer now your kind of future and where is my position on this? I mean, I think it's connected to the environment, but it's also connected to the way in the pushing against the way in which people get information. And I really appreciate you for doing this, because to me, this is so much better than finding out information through social or through tweets or whatever. You know, I don't think that you can talk about this book, you know, in that way. So.
Right. Well, John, I'm kind of been reading some of the really great questions that people have written in the chat section in the right column. I think I'm going to kind of link two closely related questions for you. So Julia Molitor asks, she says, does your book address the morality of zoos? And then Maria Beusterien asks a somewhat related question. She asks, are there parallels between the spectacles of animals and those of the human punishment? And are we consequently in an age where destruction of animals and their habitats has been made private rather than public? I thought those two questions were kind of related to each other. So those are
Thank
great.
you, Julie Maltzer and Maria. Julie's question relates to something I actually wanted to talk about when Abel was reading about the reading from the book, because he was reading about the ewer and those animals that were on the ewer. Those animals were an elephant and a rhinoceros. Those were put in a zoo. And that whole chapter is a critique of a certain way in which we've put animals as spectacle in zoos. I mean, at least from when I was a kid, until recently, and zoos are obviously very complex places, because in a way a zoo is a microcosm of the world right now, because we are controlling reproduction and future production of what animals are. If you look at a map of the world, the weight of the planet is humans are in the middle, and then all around them are domestic animals like cows. They weigh a lot. If you were to add them all up, they weigh a lot more than all the humans. If you were to look at what are wild animals, it would be a little dot on this huge map. I mean, we are quickly ending this sort of whatever would be what you guys would call wild animals. So short answer, the first chapter criticizes that ewer and what that king was doing when he wanted to take these animals and make them for a spectacle. Because he just wanted to show that he could control the entire world and that he had power over it, and he wanted everybody to see it. And that's what the animal was. So it was a critique of zoos in that capacity. So that I would say that I do criticize a basic, one of the important, well, this fundamental part of, at least zoos were imperial places for powerful people. And this is even before the creation of the modern zoo. And so I don't know, I think that's how I'll answer for now.
Yeah, there's this kind of a related question that Javier Irigoyen Garcia sent. It says, animals a spectacle. What is the peculiarity of each of the animals you study in relation to spectacle? Meaning early modern human animals did not interact with all of these non-human animals in the way. So what does the rhino have in common with the bull in terms of spectacle? What are the particularities of each animal? And of course, if Javier wants to unmute himself and get more.
Javier, yeah, if you want to
here.
explain, I mean, I could start to answer. I mean, the first thing that came to me is that in Roman times, there was, and during the Roman spectacle, and a really common thing that was actually disseminated like through books was when this rhino took a bull and just tossed it up like a paper doll, because this was part of the spectacle then. In Spain, this kind of thing with the rhino did not happen. The rhino was a different sort of spectacle creature in Spain at this time. Javier, I don't know if you want me to talk. The peculiarity of each animal is a long story. Obviously, bull, if you hear bull and you're talking about Spain, that's a very specific story. Historically, I can say that, I'll say one answer. Theater in Spain, on stage, in the commercial theater, when you went to see a play, You could see a dog, you could see little birds, you could even see horses. They would walk in through the corral and they would be part of a play, alive animals. You would never see a live bull, or you would never see a live lion, but you would see a live lion and bull in different spectacle places. And a lot of part of the third chapter was I had to figure out, well, where did they see them? Sometimes they did sometimes do stage combats in hospitals, but mainly they created these outdoor, put up scaffolding places like in the center of town or by the town. And so they did a what the short answer is, staged combat spectacle was very theatrical, but it was in a different mental space than when you did plays. You could have domestic animals with plays, and you could have wild animals in these other kinds of spectacles, which means then again that the bull in this logic was a wild animal. And that's very important for the book. I don't know, Javier, if I started to answer your questions, because I'm not sure where you were going with that, because peculiarity of an animal is a very complex, obviously for a zoologist or someone, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know either where I'm going with this question, but thank you. I mean, when I was guessing just that I mean, bulls are kind of common, and you could see. I'm thinking, for example, of La Serrana de la Vera, in which actually she fights with a bull. It's not a real bull, but it's the head of a bull that should appear through the cortex.
Yes,
right?
yes.
So
thank you very much for that. If you wanted to have a play and you wanted to have a bull or a lion, at this time, you would have a bull head, like Javier just said. Javier, thank you for coming. Javier studies theater from this time. And in this one play, there's this really strong power hunting woman play by Lope de Vega. He describes a bull on stage, and so a lot of people, well, actually people in the 1950s and 60s said, oh, this play says a real lion was on stage. No, actually one of the most common costumes in theater troupes from the time was like a lion costume. But there was never a real lion in the play. So there was a clear separation. And I find that separation between what was shown in the proper plays and the stage animal combat is very important to the story behind all this. So thank you for that. So again, the play that Javier is talking about was the stage directions say, a bullhead comes out and starts butting her as if she were in a bullfight and throwing her. And it just is a description of the animal using animal body parts rather than the real animal. And then again, of course, well, the story of bullfighting this time is another long answer, so I won't get into that, but there were obviously spectacles with live bulls too, so.
Sarah Gingrich, Sarah, do you mind unmuting your microphone and just asking your question directly? You had a great question for John.
All right. Well, thank you, Susan and Hema, for organizing this. And thank you so much, John, for sharing your research. I think we've discussed some of your findings off and on prior to the pandemic, but I guess I never asked you this question. I probably commented you before that because I do my research at the Archivo de Indias in Seville, I am usually looking for humans, right? but just very anecdotically, I found a couple of documents. One's about tigers from the Amazon being transported to Madrid or to somewhere in Spain, and something terrible happens in the way or something. But these are really anecdotal sources. So my question for you is if you could expand on your research methodology. How are you finding the information about these animals to not only name them, but to sort of like design a biogeography for them? So I find that very innovative. So could you discuss that with us?
The biogeography or how, or my whole.
Your research methodology.
Yeah.
How do you find information about these animals?
At the end of the book, I forgot to say this, there's an appendix and a conclusion. And well, first of all, in the conclusion, I talk about how teachers could use some of this material for teaching. And then there are two appendices, which one is sort of a brief list of works where you can start to learn about some of these, some of the things I talk about in the book. And the other appendix is an idea for teaching a class using this biogeography. With respect, well, for example, one of the books in the list, in that list, is by a historian who unfortunately died a few years ago. But in his book, he talks about those tigers that you mentioned. He talks about how 4 jaguars were shipped to Philip IV. And he gives a very specific, he does, I'll be honest, when I say, Abel, I'm not a historian, I'm not a historian in that I'm working with the I don't start my methodology by working with the documents, or do I kind of use secondhand, I use historians who have found the archives. And so I know about that, the specific scenario of those tigers that you talked about from reading this guy's book. So with respect to my methodology, that is very complicated. I would say that ever since I began my research as a graduate student, I was interested in issues that had to do with culture. The biggest issue that I first was interested in was what did blood mean at this time? I think over the years, I've tried to put it a lot of times within my field or within specific, with my field being literature from this time period. But at this point, I would say my methodology is when I find what I'm interested in. For example, the whole thing about armadillos, I was interested in the history of museums. And so my methodology was studying what is the history of the Natural History Museum? When did specimens become, at least in the modern period, part of a museum culture? An animal specimen, why? What was it for? Was there a period before it was scientific? So I'd say, I don't know if I'm answering your question, except that I do follow what I think is an important, something that I'm passionate about. And then I look at it in a historical, cultural, literary context. And I don't ever dismiss any discipline. I mean, I haven't read the questions, but I did see, I think Tim mentioned Jane Goodall. I mean, I'm interested in other people in other disciplines who've been passionate about similar things and find out if they say things that interconnect with the broad project I'm doing. I mean, those things do come later because I do consider myself a specialist in things written in Spanish during this time period, broadly speaking. So does that answer it? Okay.
There are a number of great questions still. We could put on the table here. There's John Moretti. Do you mind unmuting your mic and just kind of articulating what you were asking about in the chat?
Sure, yeah. So I just was thinking of this idea of biogeography and where these animals came from, especially in relation to where they're ending up. And just wondering a little bit about the physical methods, but also the cultural and interpersonal connections that must have gone into bringing these animals.
Oh my gosh, the biggest, the most dramatic answer, if you're asking about the 5 animals that I deal with, the most dramatic one is Abada, who came from a wild, north India, and was probably captured after her mother was slaughtered in a hunt, and then was taken by a Mughal emperor, Akbar. And then, so that Abada's particular journey, it starts in that place and then gets on a boat, and the complicated, I mean, I had to study for a long time what it was to travel on a boat. So this meant both humans and animals on boats, because horses were, it was pretty easy to find images from the period of how horses were carried. They were put in the lower hull of the ship, and they were, their feet weren't on the ground. They were kind of on these little, I don't know how to say it. They were on these straps. They were strapped in when they were brought around from Iberia to Asia or America. But my question was, how in the heck was Abada put on the ship? How did she survive in the sun? Pachyderms need lots of moisture on their skin all the time. What went on with that? What went on Abada? Who was taking care of her? What was put on her? Fish oil, butter. I mean, they're all kinds. So the whole question, that's your question about, so that's the most dramatic one. And the 3 months or more that Abada went from India to Lisbon and then carried across land. I still don't know exactly how she was taken from Lisbon to Madrid. So that's one. The other question, probably not as dramatic, but for me also interesting, is this armadillo and how it ended up in the middle of Seville. In some guy's house where he has a bunch of armor, a bunch of paintings, and then he has this one animal that represents the Indies, which meant, basically it meant West Indies and East Indies, which basically meant America. The animal in his along with an armored, and there were also live horses in this museum too, by the way, which is interesting for people today because they don't think of live horses as part of a museum. But so there was also this Armadillo Carapace. So armadillos they didn't care about transporting armadillos live. They could have, because they brought an elephant and a rhino live, but they didn't care about armadillos live, which I was very interested in. Why not? Because they just cared about that there was natural armor. And so they would bring carapaces from the Americas, because the armadillo is an American animal. There are like 21 species here in America, and they were brought over to Europe, and they were actually in marketplaces all over Europe, and they were even in even the Ottoman Empire. They were selling them in markets because there was this cool animal with armor, and so it was a kind of collectible item representing America, or the Indies, America, Asia, everything at that time. So those are some answers to your questions. I don't know if that was it, but it's. Thank you for asking that, because that really had me while I was doing that. Because to go back to Sarah's question, Sarah Gingrich's, there was really no methodology for figuring that stuff out. There was no single book for coming up with those answers. And so there are a lot of holes. I don't know a lot of parts of I don't know where Fuleko was killed and when he was eaten, if he was eaten, exactly who gave him to who. I do have some good ideas though, and that was, I guess, a historian's fun part about this, was like finding out the names of new people who were had this kind of power to exchange, because obviously the people who were doing this were men with power, either nobles or kings who really had control over these. Again, because as Susan mentioned before, they were considered exotic because they were transferred. And that's a very wonderful, complicated question. And it's at the heart of a lot of this book is how something has value, becomes exotic, and why it's considered it. And I'm trying obviously to explode that from the inside out by talking about it, just so that we have more, like Susan said, mutual compassion.
That's a good connection to Lucas's question, actually. And then if perhaps if there aren't any more questions, we could end with Lucas's question. So Lucas, do you mind, instead of me reading your words in the chat, if you could just ask the question directly?
Sure. Yeah. I was interested in this, what you were saying earlier, John, about the bull, though a domestic animal, being grouped with the lion or the rhino in its kind of untamed, violent, little grouping. So my question is it significant in this context that unlike the lion or the rhino, these fighting bulls are actually bred? I think they were already bred, right? The Toro de Lidia was specifically bred and raised and presumably marketed and sold for spectacle, and that the fighting bull exists alongside its more domesticated, often right, castrated kind of peers or analogs, so that where there is no domestic armadillo or domestic rhino, there is a domestic bull. And how does that affect the way this animal signifies, I guess?
Wow, great question. It gets at the heart of some of the biggest questions behind the book. First, to go back to John's question about movement, so the bull that I talk about in this book was moved the shortest distance, probably like 25, 30 miles. But even finding out about where that bull lived, Harama is the bull's name. And it's Harama because the king's most famous bulls, there are about 200 of them, lived in the Harama, near the Harama River, south of Madrid at that particular palace. And just finding out how the bull arrived to the center of downtown Madrid was a very complicated, long, something that I didn't find actually till almost the book was ready to go into press, because so that was a very complicated question. With respect to the big picture question, the philosophical question that you're asking, well, we can maybe talk about it later, but I'll give some answers right now. I do think that it's at the heart of the book because I think that this idea of wild and domestication is completely obsolete in the times that we're living in. I think it's a completely obsolete term, if you guys are thinking about the word wild animal and domestic animal. I don't know, I don't quite have the vocabulary, I haven't gone there yet, but what I can say is that you're completely right. For some reason, ever since like way before the Greeks, people wanted to breed a bull that was more wild, especially in Spain, but also in other cultures, other times. And they wanted to make that animal suffer as part of a spectacle. So this book is about spectacles, and it's about, taking animals and breeding them for spectacles. And so, I mean, I was really happy this semester with one of my students who sort of had been in Spain and didn't like the bullfight, and she wanted to write a paper about bullfights and criticism of it. And I said, well, we're doing something more planetary, more global. And she found an image of something called El Toro Mano, which was in front of the Guggenheim in northern Spain. A group of people painted themselves and they lied on the ground, about 100 people, in the form of a bull. And a lot of them painted themselves all black, and then some of them painted themselves red. And from an aerial point of view, you can see this bull lying on the ground all bloody. And she talked about, and I bring up the idea of the Guggenheim because this is a sort of international artistic space where there was this living sculpture of people imitating a dead bull. So I really liked that because she was bringing the idea of raising animals for just being a spectacle for humans and to suffer into question, and not just criticizing the Spanish bullfight, which is a complicated thing within Spain. It's also sort of a planetary problem of raising an animal just to watch it and suffer. So, yeah, and one other answer to your question. And so I was happy with how that student was taking some ideas that we were doing in this class. But I think there's also something about, human responsibility and human interaction, and what is a new form of a spectacle, because I don't think animals will disappear from being spectacle. And I do talk about in the last chapter how you can have mutual, like, for example, I'll just give one example of mutual compassion. Someone who swims with a whale and who sings can sing, and then the whale will sing differently. But the human can also sing differently, learning from the whale's song. So that's one idea of, I don't really have any specific idea. I think the artists and people in the future will be thinking about the ways in which we're living with animals. And again, this is not a political book in terms of animal rights, but it's thinking about aesthetics and art. And so it's sort of thinking about that and asking, where are we going in the future? So thanks for that question. I don't know. Again, yeah, because, yeah.
Well, that's a very powerful way to end, John. With no, that's a great idea to stay with. This has been just remarkable. John's talking about human interaction, human spectacle, human compassion. I'm looking at all of your faces and I can see where you are, and it's all really quite overwhelming. So it's been very moving actually to see all of you, to celebrate this marvelous work. We've created this beautiful, all too, it's very short temporal space, social space we've created. So I thank everyone for allowing this great moment to happen this afternoon. It's been very humanizing. um, Normally, we would have a great celebration and we would have at least one glass of wine together. So in that spirit, I'm going to have a glass of wine myself, celebrate being able to have been with you for a few minutes this afternoon. It's been great. And of course, John, I know you've encouraged everyone to contact you, email you. I think, Erica, you posted the PDF of the introduction to the book, and Erica and Amsterdam Press has actually kind of a special discount with a code that you can find at the beginning of the chat if you'd like to purchase the book, I think before December 31st, and really get your hands on it and enjoy every page of it. So it's been great. Thank you, especially to Erica and Abel for being a part of this. And congratulations, John.
Thank you. Thank you.
Right. Take care, everyone.